but what I'm going to try and do today is bring context and understanding to what's going on in Israel. Woof! Let's see how that goes. In the meantime, what I wanted to say is today we're going to be dealing with what is, in my opinion, one of the most complicated and multi-layered situations, conflicts in the entire world. And yet, very often, if you've been following along in the media and certainly on social media, it's often reduced to a very simplistic and binary way of looking at what's going on. You're either, depending on who you follow on Twitter or Instagram, Facebook, or which news channels you choose to watch or newspapers you choose to read, you're either going to be understanding that Israel is a settler, colonial, genocidal, apartheid state with a bloodlust for the murder of Palestinians, or perhaps you're getting a completely opposite perspective. Perhaps you're getting a perspective that the Palestinians are a rejectionist and invented people, that every single Palestinian is a barbarian dedicated to the destruction of Israel and members of a terrorist organization. Now, the reality is that neither of those are true, but very often that's what's coming across. And I would suggest that these two narratives that I put forward for you are neither apt, correct, or acceptable for a whole variety of different reasons. Now, why is it that we're hearing these different narratives? Why is it that we're not getting a sense of the shades of gray between the white and the black, so to speak? This multi-layered, nuanced situation, why is it being reduced? And I would suggest, and again, you're free to not agree with me, and I'm going to bring that up again in just a few moments' time, that perhaps it's because in many ways, many in the world today look through a liberal prism. And I say liberal in inverted commas, because I would suggest it's actually not particularly liberal at all, but an idea of looking at what's going on through the prism or the acculturalization of what's going on in whatever country we're in, or our own experiences. So looking at what's going on in Israel and Palestine as something that is a battle between good and bad, so good and evil. One side is good, one side is evil. One side is the colonized and the other side is the colonizer. One side is white and the other side is black. One side is all powerful, the other side is powerless. And the reality is an awful lot more complicated than that. But once we have a preconditioned narrative or understanding of how the world works, particularly a Western understanding of how the world works from all the things that are going on, and we try and apply it to what's going on here and to the Middle East, not only does it not work, but we understand, we receive a skewed understanding of what's going on, but it can also be incredibly harmful and dangerous, not only to, for example, Muslims and Jews found in various places around the world, but also in adding more seething hate to the pot. And we certainly have an awful lot of seething hate here in this area. And this is the furthest away from helping to be able to actually make a difference and resolve some of these intractable problems that we're dealing with right here. What I want to do today is not to push you to think one thing or another. You will, I would imagine, maybe get a sense of my politics. Those that have been following me for the last year, you may or may not know where I stand. But that hopefully it won't matter too much. But on the other hand, what I would say is that understand, like me, like everybody else, we all have our own bias. We all have our own way of looking at the world. And it's very important, whether it's the news media or me, to take everything with a pinch of salt, to think critically about all the information that is coming at you and who is giving you that information. I've said it many times, so anyone who knows me well is going to be sick of it, but I'm going to say it again. And I think it's so apt to the Middle East and so apt to what we're talking about today. There are so many people around the world and here in the region that believe that they have the full understanding, that they have the monopoly on the truth, that they know exactly what's going on and that they have all the answers. I would suggest to you that those people, not only are they wrong or misguided, but it's likely that they're part of the problem. And the moment that we not only insist that our way of looking at the world is the only way to look at the world, but we're not prepared to listen to anyone else's opinions and ideas and understand that reality is an awful lot more complicated, certainly here in this region, then it's very, very difficult to get an understanding. So all I ask of you today is I'm going to attempt to give different perspectives from the left and the right, the religious, the secular, pro, against, all kinds of things. What I hope is that all of us, including myself, and it's something I say to you because I say it to myself, to try and put your dogma at the door and listen. You don't have to agree with everything. It may even strengthen your own opinion, and that's fabulous. But the most important thing is to understand, because the more context, the more understanding, the more ability we have to truly understand what's going on. So this is my plan. If you've come here looking for all the answers, I apologize. But as I also say very often, I hope you're going to finish today more confused than you were at the beginning. But I do hope that you have a greater context in which to place the things that you're hearing after today. So this is my plan. What we're going to do, we have quite a lot of people today. So rather than opening up for questions and talking during the session, I'm going to go through and give and try and split what's happening here into different sections. Please feel free. Please feel free to put in the chat if you have any questions and thoughts and so on. At the end of the session, we will open up for questions and thoughts and to give your own perspectives. All I ask, both in the chat and at the end, is to be respectful and do not assume that your opinion is the same opinion that everyone else has. So please feel free to put your perspectives and ideas, but please do so in a respectful and understanding manner. Again, I won't necessarily be able to look at all the questions as we go through, but we will have I will attempt to, if there's something, for example, you don't understand specific to what I'm talking about. But we certainly will open up for more questions at the end and more thoughts at the end. And if there's anything I didn't cover, again, I certainly don't know everything. As I told you before, someone that tells you they have all the answers is part of the problem. I'm no expert. What I can tell you is that I'm a father. I'm an Israeli. I'm a father. I grew up in the UK. I'm a former shaliach of the Jewish Agency and for the youth movements in the United Kingdom. What I'm going to be talking about is the reality that I live. So other than that, I'm going to leave it there and we're going to begin. The first thing that I wanted to do, I'm going to attempt to do it very, very quickly, and I'm going to apologize in advance, is that I want to give a little bit of historical background in order that no matter what our backgrounds are, of all of us here on the session today, whether we feel that we know a lot or feel that we have certain things that we'd like to know more, I'm going to try and put everyone on a certain level in order to have the context to talk about what's been going on. What I will say is when I give a little bit of a historical background, I'm not going to go into great detail and I'm not going to include absolutely every point of history. So please understand that we're not going to be talking about everything, but I am going to try and mention various things that I feel are relevant that you need to understand in order to get the context, so to speak. Very quickly, just before we begin, just to show for those people that may be not too familiar with how the region looks, I've just zoomed in on Israel, very exciting. 9.3 million people living in a country the size of New Jersey, the size of Wales, 8,500 square miles, 22,000 square kilometers, around 264 miles from top to bottom. And if I zoom in, you're all invited. I'm not going to, some of you have been here in reality and on virtual tours. This is where I live, which you can see is approximately it's at the end of the center, beginning of the north of the country, very close to Caesarea. And the reason I wanted to bring it here is, again, just to give you some sense of scale, that this is the Mediterranean Sea, Israel's western border. And the line that I'm drawing on the map now is the eastern border, so to speak, of the internationally recognized borders of Israel, which is the 1967 line. Between 1948 and 1967, Israel was on the west, was ruling the western side and is internationally recognized in these areas. And Jordan was ruling and had annexed, applied Jordanian law to the eastern side. So just to give you some sense of perspective, that from the Mediterranean Sea in the west to the east, at the end of the internationally recognized borders of Israel, where I live, is just a little shy of 14 miles from one side of the country to the other. And I can see from the sea to the green line on the east, just from the top of my apartment, just to give you some kind of sense of the size of Israel. Just to also show you some of the places that you've been hearing about in the news, just to see how close everything is. So Jerusalem, which is the capital of Israel that we'll be talking about later, which is a city of 900,000 people. It's also the largest city in Israel. We can see over here. And Gaza, And I'll bring out more maps later on to explain various things. Gaza is just down here towards the beginning of the south of Israel on the western side, and Gaza has borders with both Israel and Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, which is once more part of Egypt today. So this is, yeah, and later on we'll be talking also about the internal situation in Israel, and one of the mixed cities of Jews, Christians and Muslims living together. There were an awful lot of internal violence within Israeli society, was the city of Lod. And again, you can just see, and I've deliberately wanted to bring it for you, because just to see where is Ben Gurion Airport, just to see where is Tel Aviv, and just to see, and here we have Lod, just to see how close everything is. And if I clear all of this and just zoom out a little bit, there we go. You can see both Lod, Tel Aviv, the airport, all of these places are very, very close. Nothing in Israel is very far. In fact, Gaza rockets today are able to reach all the way up to Harish, where I showed you I live. So just to give you a little bit of background on the map. So, without any further ado, we're going to begin. And as I mentioned, I'm going to give a attemptedly brief historical background, just to understand different connections to where we are. So first of all, the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, to Judea, dates back well over 3,000 years. Here we can see an image, an illustration of King Solomon's first temple 3,000 years ago. Of course, all of the strong biblical connections to the land of Israel, but from a historical, archaeological understanding that 3,000 years ago, there was a Jewish independent nation, so to speak, here in the land of Israel. Moving forward, the first temple was destroyed. The Jews returned under the Persians. The area around Jerusalem became known as Judea. The second temple was built. Judaism, which is a little strange, and that's also part of the story. And I say a little strange, I can say, because it's not strictly speaking just a religion, but a people, a culture, a land, a history, and a language. The Jews from Judea, and we're understanding, again, often one of the discussions is if it's conqueror and conquered, if it's indigenous and colonialists. Here we already understand that we're muddying the waters here, understanding a deep historical link between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. Moving forward, in terms of, we mentioned Judea, and when the King Herod rebuilds the Jewish Second Temple, the land is known as Judea. The province becomes the Roman province of Judea. And in and around the year 135, 136, after the Second Temple has been destroyed many years earlier, the Jews still remaining in the land in certain numbers rebel again, the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And when the Bar Kokhba rebellion is put down, the name Palestine begins to come into common usage. The Syrian province of Judea is renamed Syria Palestina, and many suggest that this is connected to a wish to erase the Jewish connection to the land and to remind us of the name of the biblical enemy of the Jews in the Bible, or the Israelites in the Bible, the Philistines, who are a long since disappeared people said to have originated from the Greek coast. Now, moving forward, the Romans and the Byzantines, if we jump forward to the beginning of the 7th century, we see the beginning of Islam in the Arabian subpeninsula, the area of Mecca, Saudi Arabia of today. And according to Islamic tradition, here we are on what Jews call the Temple Mount, because according to tradition, this is where the first and second temple stood according to Jewish tradition. But according to Islamic tradition, Surah 17, verse 1 of the Quran explains that Muhammad took a flight from the sacred mosque to the furthest mosque, whose precincts we did bless. Now, the oral tradition that accompanies this verse is that the sacred mosque is the Kaaba in Mecca, and that the furthest mosque, or in Arabic, Al-Aqsa, so this whole compound is known as Al-Aqsa, that Al-Aqsa is the area that we see here. So the Temple Mount for the Jews, according to tradition, is where the world was created from, where the temple stood and will stand, and where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac, and where God's divine presence, the Shekhinah, is located in the Holy of Holies. For Muslims, the same bedrock of Mount Moriah is believed to be where Muhammad ascended to heaven to receive further revelation, surah, from Allah, from God, from the one true God. Interestingly, according to Islamic tradition, this event of the night flight, the Isra, took place before the beginning of Islam and the building of mosques. So even if we go back 100 years in this land, the Waqf, the Islamic organization responsible for administering the holy sites, spoke openly about the site of the Dome of the Rock built by Abd al-Malik, Caliph Abd al-Malik in 691 AD, sitting on top of the area of the Jewish Temple of Solomon. It wasn't contradictory because according to Islamic theology, we understand that Judaism, or Moses's vision, Moses's receipt of the Torah wasn't fully understood. Further prophet came, Jesus or Isa, and Muhammad is the seal on the prophet, the final prophet to perfect the vision and understanding. And so the idea that an Islamic structure would sit on top of a Jewish structure is not controversial traditionally in Islam. In fact, it's connected to Islamic theology. To arrive at a furthest mosque would be to arrive at a place of worship of the one true God, Allah. For the Muslims, Elohim, Elohim, Hashem, all different names for exactly the same God of the Jews, the Muslims, the Christians, the great monotheistic faiths. Now, jumping forward, we arrive to the Crusaders. The Crusaders are kicked out by the Ayyubid Muslims, replaced by the Mamluks, and then along come the Ottomans. The Ottoman Turks are ruling here in this land. The land is ruled over by Muslims following the kicking out of the Crusaders all the way through until 1917. This area, known as Jund Palestine or Bilad Asham or Palestine, is part of the Ottoman Empire, a backwater of the Ottoman Empire, with Jews, Christians, and Muslims living within it. It's interesting to note that by the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, there was already a Jewish majority here in Jerusalem. But nonetheless, when we move through to 1917, we see the arrival of the British. And when the First World War comes to an end, or rather even before so, the Ottoman Turkish Empire collapses, the Turks lurch out of the war, the British conquer Palestine, and all of the area that you see here becomes officially the British mandate at the beginning of the 1920s, when the League of Nations, as it was then, before the creation of the United Nations, the League of Nations gives the British a mandate to rule over Palestine. Palestine, which is the administrative name for the area under the Ottoman Turks and continues to be the administrative name under the British. Now, just to show you, this is Palestine over here, and this is Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank today. This area, which today is Jordan, became a protected emirate. The British separated it from the rest of Palestine in 1921. Jews were only allowed to settle in this area, and Emir Abdallah, whose family had been ruling Mecca for the last 1,000 years, 38th generation descendant from the Prophet Muhammad, became the ruler of this area. And ultimately, Jordan, the majority of what was British Mandate Palestine, around 73% of British Mandate Palestine, became formally independent as an Arab state in 1946. In any case, as we move forward to 1946, we understand that the British, having now ended the Second World War, are feeling that the Jews and the Arabs are not getting along well with each other, competing nationalisms, Jewish and Arab nationalism inside Palestine. The British not having an awful lot of money either after the war, and decide to step out. They turn to the United Nations, who send a team to this part of Palestine, the remainder of British Mandate Palestine, around 27% of the original size, and they come up with a plan to divide it into two states. The two states that are not given names, the states are called Jewish state and Arab state. At this time, it's important to note that Palestine, as I mentioned, is the administrative name for the area. And both Jews, Muslims, and Christians saw themselves and defined themselves as Palestinian Jews, Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Christians. If anyone reads I hope there's no one here that works for the Jerusalem Post, but the Jerusalem Post, which is a not particularly wonderful newspaper in terms of the quality of the writing, I hope I haven't offended anybody, in English about Israel, but the Jerusalem Post at this time was called the Palestine Post. As a Jewish Zionist newspaper, was called the Palestine Post. Just to understand, the division that you can see here would be that the Jewish state would be in this area up here along the coast, and this area over here. The Arab state would be in the green lines that you see over here. Notice that Jerusalem was a corpus separandum. It wasn't part of either the Jewish or the Arab state, according to the partition plan. According to the partition plan of November 29th, 1947, the decision was that if and when this plan would be enacted, that the people, the residents of Jerusalem, would make a final decision 5 years later on what would be the status of the city and which state it would belong to. At that time, as I mentioned, there was already a Jewish majority in the city. In any case, this plan never came to fruition because the Arab leadership, and it's important to state that often we talk about Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians as groupings that everyone thinks the same, groupthink. The reality is very different. There are many people on both sides that wish to reject the plan and those that wish to accept the plan. But the leadership of the local Arabs inside Palestine, supported by the countries around, chose to reject the plan. And the War of Independence, as it's known in Israel, and the Nakba, or the catastrophe, as it's known by the Palestinian Arabs, begins at the end of 1947, following the Arab rejection of the partition plan. It begins as a civil war between Jews and Arabs until May 1948, when the British complete their withdrawals, and the decision is taken by the Jewish leadership to declare a state, as the British will leave to declare a Jewish state in the vacuum. The state of Israel is declared in May 15th, or May 14th rather, 1948, and the war continues on for a further 6 months. Now, Israel versus the Arab countries which have attacked from without. In very, very simple terms, at the end of that war, this map represents what happens. Now, when I say the end of the war, I'm not talking about peace agreements. These are, what we're looking at here, armistice lines. The armistice lines are such that none of the powers involved, neither Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, or Egypt, agree to that these are the final borders of the country. The surrounding countries don't accept Israel's right to exist. It's not a peace agreement. And as we're about to find out, a significant portion of Jerusalem is not part of the new Jewish state of Israel, including the old city, which falls into Jordanian hands. This area that we see here with the blue lines is the result of those armistice agreements, those temporary ceasefire lines created between the generals rather than the politicians that held for the next 19 years. These are very important lines because this is the internationally recognized borders of the state of Israel. What we don't see is over here is the Golan Heights, which was part of Syria, controlled by Syria. The West Bank that we see over here, the West Bank and the eastern side of Jerusalem and the old city is conquered in the war by Jordan. And Jordan then annexes these areas, and these areas become part of Jordan. This is the case until 1967. Gaza over here is occupied by the Egyptians, and this remains the case until 1967. So between 1948 and 1967, or the beginning of 1949 and 1967, Egypt is occupying but not annexing the Gaza Strip. The West Bank has been occupied and annexed by the Jordanians. Now, this is incredibly important because in the war, and again, we're not going to go into huge detail, somewhere in the order of 750,000 Palestinian Arabs who had been living in the borders of what became the sovereign internationally recognized state of Israel found themselves outside of the borders of Israel. Now, some of them were forcibly kicked out. Some of them were intimidated. Some of them left because a war was going on, and some were told to move out the way to make it easier for the Arabs to come in and destroy the Jews. All of these narratives are true to greater and lesser extent. Now, of these 750,000 Palestinian Arabs, some of them found themselves in Gaza. Some of them found themselves in the West Bank, some in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, and small numbers elsewhere. Now, the Palestinian Arabs that were already in Gaza and already in the West Bank are not refugees because they didn't leave their homes. But those that left what became Israel are considered refugees. Now, immediately after the war of 1948, 1949, 47 to 49, an organization was created called UNRWA, United Nations Works and Relief Agency. And the agency was created to deal with the large number of Palestinian refugees. Now, at that time, Palestinian refugees were defined as anybody who had been living in what became Israel between 1946 and 1948. Why? Because the population here in this area was very transient and moving around. So the decision was taken that they would lay a draw a line in the sand. Anyone who had moved after the summer of 1946 was not considered a refugee. And this is how they arrived to the number of approximately 750,000 refugees. Important to note that in the aftermath of the War of Independence, the Nakba, the War of 48, approximately 750,000 Jews became refugees from Arab and North African countries. And until today, the majority of Jews in Israel today, and we were talking before about viewing the conflict through whites and blacks, or browns, dark-skinned and light-skinned, the majority of Jews in Israel today are descended from Jews that moved from Arab and North African countries in 1948 at a greater extent than Jews of European origin, Ashkenazi Jews, for example. Now, critically, a short time after the creation of UNRWA, an organization specifically to deal with Palestinian refugees, a second and very important clause was put in place. And that clause that was put in place is that a Palestinian refugee is not only somebody who fled during the War of 1948 who lived in the land before 1946, but critically, a refugee could pass on their refugee status patrilineally from father to son, and that child could pass it on to his son, and so on and so on. So today, if we were talking 750,000 Palestinian refugees in 1948, today we're talking over 5 million refugees, and that number continues to grow. Now, all other refugees in the world fall under the care of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and under the definition of refugees in other areas of the world, there would be an awful lot smaller number of Palestinian refugees. So just to give some context also to some of the things that were happening, especially under the Trump administration and discussions about UNRWA, that we're talking about a refugee problem. The majority of the refugees who were born significantly after the event in which their parents and grandparents became refugees. Critically, those Palestinian refugees that ended up in Gaza did not receive Egyptian citizenship because Egypt occupied but didn't annex Gaza. The Palestinian refugees ended up here, but fell into an area that was annexed by Jordan, and most of the Palestinians, refugees and otherwise, received citizenship here for Jordan. The majority of the Palestinian refugees, almost all of them in Lebanon and Syria, including their children and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, still haven't received citizenship in Lebanon and Syria. And today, the majority of the Palestinian refugees are located in 59 different refugee camps, which today look like slum cities. And this is important also to understanding in terms of the level of poverty and despair that relates to the conflict that we're talking about today. We need to understand this situation. And also, of course, I move forward, that in 1964, 3 years before the Six-Day War, which is a very important event in the explanation, we see in 1964, this is a meeting in Cairo of the Arab League, the League of Arab Countries, and the creation of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. This is the symbol. The Palestinian Liberation Organization is not overtly one religion or another, secular, quote, in relative terms, liberation, resistance movement dedicated to the creation of a Palestinian state, originally in all of Palestine, meaning British Mandate Palestine without Jordan, as we spoke about before. And very, very importantly, we come back to the map over here. It was created in 1964, not in 1948, and critically not in 1967, when these areas fell under Israeli occupation, because there was no Palestinian state created in these areas between 1948 and 1967, either under the Egyptians or the Jordanians. In 1967, in the Six-Day War, and again, we won't go into the details of the war, but what is important is that Israel, in the Six-Day War, a feeling just before that it was going to be perhaps the end of Israel, attacks from without, not only does Israel win the war militarily, but it also gains significant territory. The Sinai Peninsula, which is later returned to Egypt, the Golan Heights, which until today is considered the eyes and the ears of Israel, overlooking Syria, whereas before the Syrians were overlooking Israel. And critically, Israel takes also, along with the Sinai, the Gaza Strip from the Egyptians, and the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the old city of Jerusalem from the Jordanians. Now, as we'll speak about later, for many people, this was incredibly exciting from a messianic religious point of view, that now more of the land of Israel is under the control of the state of Israel. But it also opens a huge Pandora's box, which is incredibly relevant to understanding what's going on today. The first Pandora's box that is opened is inside Israeli society, right and left, religious and secular. If before 1967, some people considered themselves Zionists, believing that there should be a Jewish state, that the Jews should be able to return and create a state in their homeland, in their ancestral homeland, there were many that believed that the state of Israel should exist in all of the land of Israel from the Bible. Others were not necessarily connected to the specific borders described in the Bible and would be prepared to share the land or have part of the land. This was really an academic exercise, but after 1967, it now becomes real because Israel is in control of areas which it is now must make the decision to whether it will keep those areas or not, rule those areas or not. Will those areas become part of the state of Israel? Will they become a Palestinian state? So it creates what in Hebrew we say a shesa, or a great divide within Israeli society in terms of who has the correct understanding of Zionism and the way that the Jewish state should be, so to speak. Also, very, very importantly, in these areas, suddenly millions of Palestinian Arabs now come under Israeli control. Now, Israel does not annex the Gaza Strip until today, or the West Bank. So the Palestinian Arabs under Israel's control do not receive Israeli citizenship. Up until the beginning of the 1990s, they fall under Israeli military law. And this is the situation through to the Oslo Accords in the beginning of the 1990s. But suddenly, whereas the Arabs living in Israel, who remained in Israel and their descendants after 1948, become citizens of the state of Israel. Today, I mentioned Israel is a country of 9.3 million people. Almost 2 million of them are Arab, predominantly Muslim, but also Christians and other minorities. And under law, they have the same rights and obligations as any Israeli, regardless of ethnicity and faith. At the same time, the Arabs here, and again, the difference is an arbitrary ceasefire line, if you remember. The Arabs here are now under Israeli control, but are not Israeli citizens and don't have the same rights, obligations, and privileges as their fellow Arab who are living inside Israel and hold Israeli citizenship. Opens a huge, huge Pandora's box that Israel is still dealing with today. Very importantly, almost at the end of the introduction, or the prolonged introduction of history, I mentioned that in 1967, Israel comes into control of Jerusalem. Before 1967, Israel was in control of West Jerusalem. Barbed wire separated the other side of Jerusalem, the eastern side of Jerusalem, which was under Jordanian control. Within this area of Jerusalem, critically, is the old city of Jerusalem, with the holy sites of both Christians, Muslims, and Jews. The Temple Mount for the Jews and the Western Wall, the Dome of the Rock for Muslims, Mount of Olives, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, etc., etc. All of these are in the east of the city. After 1967, Israel controls all of Jerusalem. The east, in Israeli political parlance, is united with the west. And critically, here also you can see the boundaries were expanded as well. Again, we won't get into a huge discussion on the politics of Jerusalem because that's a whole session in itself. But what is important to say is that unlike the West Bank, in that direction, all the way that way, down to the Jordan River, which Israel has not annexed until today, Israel does annex the eastern side of Jerusalem. So today, all of this area is Israel. From an international perspective, anything over this green line was conquered from Jordan in 1967, is Judea, the territories, the West Bank, Palestine, occupied territories, all different names for the same area. From an Israeli legal perspective, this area over here is Israel, as opposed to the West Bank. Critically, of course, there are Palestinian Arabs living in the eastern side of the city. Unlike their compatriots in the West Bank, who are not in Israel, even under Israeli law, because the West Bank hasn't been annexed, East Jerusalem has been annexed. And today there are approximately 350,000 Palestinian Arabs living in Israel, East Jerusalem, not necessarily recognized internationally, but according to Israeli law. This is also part of the story. There is a mechanism for them to receive citizenship, but it's difficult, it's cumbersome, and the vast majority of Palestinians in Jerusalem do not want to have citizenship, because to take citizenship would be to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the eastern side of Jerusalem, their homes and where they live. All of this is incredibly relevant to understanding the tensions that we're talking about today. The last thing I'm going to do with the background is refer to the Oslo Accords of the 1990s. In the 1990s, we had a peace process was created. The Oslo Accords, the difficult problems of where would the borders be in a two-state solution? How will Jerusalem be divided or shared? What will be the fate of the refugees, and the demand that every refugee, including all of those descendants, will be able to return to their lands that they left in Israel in 1948, will all be put to the back burner, and the focus will be on building relations between Israelis and Palestinians and the creation of the Palestinian Authority, which will be the government infrastructure of the future Palestinian state. At this time, we see the creation of a Palestinian government, the Palestinian law courts, education system, health system, and so on and so forth. And critically, the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which had previously been under Israeli military occupation, suddenly are divided into different zones. The dark areas you see are Area A. Area A is areas that came under, according to the Oslo Accords, signed between Yasser Arafat, who was the head of the head of the PLO and the head of the Palestinian Authority, and Israel, initially Yitzhak Rabin. The agreements that were signed dictated that the areas that you see in brown, which are the major Palestinian cities, would be under full Palestinian civil and security control, meaning police force, armed Palestinians in those areas. The areas that you see in yellow are and you see in Gaza, most of Gaza is Area A. The areas you see in yellow are Area B. These are Palestinian villages where Palestinian civil administration is in control, so Palestinian healthcare, refuse removal, taxation, law courts, etc. But security still falls under the auspices of Israel, the Israeli army more specifically. And the areas that you see in white are Area C, which includes settlements, Israeli villages and towns that were created after 1967. And you see them also here, no longer in Gaza Strip, but they were at the time in the 1990s. Area C is areas under full Israeli political and military control, so fully under the control of Israel. Ultimately, the peace process collapsed and fell apart, but this legacy of A, B, and C still exists today. And critically, here in Gaza, and I'll speak more about it, but in 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew all of its military forces from Gaza, and also all of these white areas were also left behind, and 21 Israeli settlements in Gaza were also left. All of the land and the buildings were left, but all of the Israeli citizens living in Gaza were pulled out in 2005, and there hasn't been a presence of Israelis inside Gaza since 2005. Again, it was very quick, although it may have seemed long, and relatively simplistic, but I wanted to put everyone on a level just to understand some very, very basic tenets. And now we'll go a little deeper. I can see Victoria wrote something instructive on the side, so I'll try and now go a little bit deeper. The first thing that I wanted to speak about today is about, and to understand what's going on in Israeli politics. In Israel, first of all, the Israeli political system is incredibly complicated. Israeli political system is a system of proportional representation. Everyone in every Israeli citizen has one vote. That vote is for a political party. It doesn't matter if you live in the far south or the far north, your vote is for this one polity. We all vote for the same thing. There are 120 seats in the Israeli parliament. So in theory, a party that would receive 61 seats would have an absolute majority to rule. The reality is that no party in the short history of Israel has ever received 61 seats, and therefore there is always a need to build coalitions. Just to give you some kind of context, in our last elections, we've had 4 elections in the last 2 years. We are likely going to have a 5th. not for sure, but very likely about to have a fifth. In the last election, the largest party was the Likud party with less than 25% of the vote, meaning that coalition building involves making concessions to other parties in order that you will be able to build a government. That can be very difficult, especially when other parties have a different ideology to you. Incorporated into this very difficult situation with Israel, a very fractured society, as we're going to understand and explore, which is expressed through its political system, which I would suggest is a positive thing, because we have parties of religious and secular, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Arab Islamic, Arab secular, left-wing in economic terms, right-wing in economic terms, security terms, religious, you name it, we have different parties from different groupings. And it means that the issues of Israel are generally expressed in civil society as opposed to violence in the streets, or at least up until around 3 weeks ago. In addition to this, very important, the current prime minister, who is in some ways now a caretaker, is Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu has been indicted for corruption, fraud, and breach of trust. As prime minister, he is able to avoid going to trial. If he will lose his position, as prime minister, then it will be much more difficult for him to avoid trial. This is part of also what is going on. Opinion polls would suggest that if Netanyahu was not the leader of the Likud party, there would already be a right-wing coalition formed in Israel. But because Netanyahu is the leader of the party, and opinion on Netanyahu is very split in Israel. Many people are great admirers of Netanyahu, and many believe that in Israel, many Israeli citizens believe that he has his own interests before the interest of the country. So it's very, very split. Those that believe that he can do no wrong, and those believe that he is the source of all that is wrong. Now, all of this is very important, because in order to make a coalition at a time when Israeli political system is very fractured and we're finding it difficult, struggling, again, 4 elections in 2 years, in order to be able to make a coalition of parties that would be prepared to join him, Netanyahu has very much moved to the right on the political spectrum. And in order to make a coalition, he needs parties, as I mentioned, that would be able to join him. One of the parties that would be able to join him is a party called the National Zionist, the religious Zionist party. And the religious Zionist party, before the elections a few months ago, was struggling to pass the threshold, which means they wouldn't have got enough votes to get into the Knesset. At the time, Netanyahu was campaigning also on their behalf, because for them to enter the Knesset would give him a potential coalition partner. This is incredibly important, because this particular political party also has members that polarize opinion. The person that I put on the screen before me, his name is Itamar Ben-Gvir. Itamar Ben-Gvir is a long-time right-wing political activist, and I think it would be appropriate for me to say that he is incredibly mistrustful of Arabs and very disparaging of a Palestinian national viewpoint. And by being elected into the parliament with the support of Benjamin Netanyahu, essentially, we suddenly have a lot of opinions, because these opinions exist in Israeli society alongside more moderate. There are extreme opinions on all sides, Jewish, Arab, religious, secular. But now we have representatives within the parliament that, for example, here have even been members of banned extremist religious parties, such as Kach, or supporters of parties that have been banned in previous years from the Knesset. So what we're seeing is that Israeli politics has moved to the right, and by virtue of people with more extreme opinions now represented on the right of Israeli politics, these opinions are also more accepted or legitimized in the street. In addition, strangely, we've on the one hand talking about the rise of the more and more extremism and the legitimization of extremism, but at the same time, after the last election, Benjamin Netanyahu was not able to form a coalition. And so the right to form a coalition fell to the next party down, who received less votes. And that is a centrist party called Yesh Atid, whose leader is called Yair Lapid. Now, Yair Lapid is trying to form a coalition of parties that are from the left, the center, and the right, that are not prepared to sit with Netanyahu and want Netanyahu to go home and to leave the Israeli political scene. Now, there are those on the right that were seemingly prepared to join that coalition. I should also mention that Benjamin Netanyahu, in order to form a coalition, was prepared to sit with an Islamist party, which you couldn't necessarily put on the left, but an Islamist Arab party. But some of the parties within the potential coalition are not prepared to sit with Arabs. And so Yair Lapid received the mandate to try and put the coalition together. This was the situation right before all of the current violence broke out. Now, even though we're speaking about more and more extremism in Israeli society, and in a few moments we'll also talk about some great tensions around Jerusalem and Israeli-Palestinian issues, at the same time, we see really interesting phenomenon taking place in Arab society. Now, one of the things that was posted on the chat before was about Arabs serving in the army, not serving in the army. It's incredibly complicated to go into because in general, there are groups of Arabs within Israeli society who do serve in the army. The Druze, although the Druze would not define themselves necessarily as Arab, but Druze men are compulsorily conscripted at their own request. We have non-Arab Muslims like the Circassians who serve in the army. We have a significant number of Bedouin Arab Muslims who serve in the army from both the south and the north of the country. And there are also volunteers, less so from the Muslim Arab society, but also from the Christian Arab society. But it is certainly true that many Arabs are not expected to serve in the army. Now, it's important to look at it from two different directions, because one argument is that by not serving in the army, not serving in the army, many Jewish Israelis will say they don't pull their weight, they don't give to the country, they shouldn't be treated in the same way as the rest of us that serve in the army. The flip side of that is there are also probably the same Jewish Israelis that would say, I don't want them to serve in the army because I see them maybe as a fifth column. Their national narrative of many of them is together with the Palestinian national narrative, and it would be a danger for them to have access to the weapons in the army or potential intelligence and so on and so forth. At the same time, there are many Arabs serving with distinction in the Israeli army. But nonetheless, this does come back to the situation of Arabs in Israel, because on the one hand, under law, Arabs in Israel are equal citizens under the law inside Israel. At the same time, there are many aspects of Israeli society that are discriminatory, by the way, not only towards Arabs, but also other groupings, also within Jewish society as well. But many Arabs inside Israel feel very connected to Israel, but many Arabs inside Israel do not feel connected to Israel, whether it be a Palestinian national narrative, the fact that the flag has a Star of David and the national anthem speaks of a yearning Jewish soul, whether there is some kind of unofficial glass ceiling, because if you've served in the army, you have access to certain roles in society. All kinds of things. At the same time, there are Arabs serving in the most senior positions in the country, including the Supreme Court of the State of Israel and a number of diplomats serving Israel overseas. That's a very complicated situation. What I would say is that in 2018, and again, part of this move to the right, a law was passed called the Nation State Law. I won't go into it in great detail. What I will say is it made very little difference practically of anything, but it did emphasize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, which again made many people within Israel, many Arabs within Israel, including, for example, the incredibly loyal Druze, feel as though in some ways they were being told, whether it made a practical difference, but engendering a feeling that in some way they were not full members of society. Now, one of the issues within Arab society in terms of investment is that, of course, in politics, when you are an important group within the polity, the politicians are going to court you by coming up with plans and ideas in order to help you. Traditionally, Arabs in Israel vote in very low numbers and predominantly vote for Arab political parties. The majority of the Arab political parties traditionally speak a lot more about Palestinian issues than they speak about the internal issues of Israeli society. And whilst we've had numerous Arab members of parliament in other parties, no Arab party has ever formed part of a ruling coalition government. Now, I mentioned that Netanyahu, it seemed, was prepared to bring one of the Arab parties in. This is Mansour Abbas. Mansour Abbas is the head of a party called RAM. RAM is an Islamist party with roots actually connected to the Islamic Brotherhood, which also Hamas come from the Islamic Brotherhood. That said, the RAM party today focuses almost exclusively on issues of Arabs inside society. So whether that be education, economic incentives, lack of investment, crime, which is rampant within the Arab sector. And right before all of the violence that we're speaking about now broke out, it seemed that RAM were actually going to finally, or were going to be an Arab party that would enter into a government coalition with those on the right and the left and the center, and would be the kingmakers in forming a coalition that would see Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu leave his position. And then everything happened. And it's important to understand this, because there are those on the one hand that say the fact that everything happened is a blessing, because can you imagine if the Arab party would form part of a government coalition and then all of this would happen? How can the Arab with an Islamic background possibly be involved in making advanced, important strategic and security decisions on behalf of the state of Israel? The flip side of that, and this is one of the parties that was due to be part of the coalition, this is Naftali Bennett from the New Right Party. As soon as all the violence broke out, he left, and again, he left the coalition, they left the planning of the coalition, exactly as I was speaking about. There are also those on the other side of Israeli society that are incredibly suspicious of those on the right and of Benjamin Netanyahu, because right up until the breakout of violence, it seemed that Netanyahu was going to fall. And now all of the coalition against him has fallen apart. Again, I am not suggesting and giving you my opinion or perspective that this is what is behind what is going on. But important to understand that these are the narratives that are floating around in Israeli society, that whether they were involved or not involved, whether they deliberately reacted slowly or whether they had every intention of dealing with the situation well, this idea of whether one is serving oneself or the country and what are the political motivations behind what's going on, there are certainly trends within Israel suggesting that there is something more behind what's going on. In the meantime, and I'm going to talk about that also from the Palestinian side in a few moments' time. In fact, now I want to talk very, very briefly about Palestinian national politics. Because again, I haven't yet spoken about the violence, and I haven't yet spoken about Jerusalem, I haven't yet spoken about Gaza. But if you don't get what we're talking about now, you're not necessarily going to understand everything that's going on. So let me speak briefly about Palestinian politics. Let's move across. Young Palestinians today are incredibly disillusioned with their politicians. I'm now talking not about Arabs, Israelis, or Palestinian citizens of Israel. I'm talking about Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. Palestinians, and if we're speaking about the West Bank specifically, are incredibly disillusioned with their politicians. We've seen the peace process fall apart at the beginning of the 2000s. We've seen the second Intifada. We've seen rounds and rounds of violence since 2007, 4 separate rounds of violence between Israel and the Hamas with Gaza. We're no closer to the establishment of an independent Palestinian state, whether it be on all of Palestine or whether it be a 2-state solution or whether it be a 1-state solution for all its citizens. The Palestinian Authority, which today and has predominantly been led by the Fatah, which is the largest party within the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The head of Fatah is Mahmoud Abbas. This is the same party as Yasser Arafat. The Fatah are perceived to be lining their own pockets, corrupt, and they have strong security control, coordination with Israel, and are seen to be in some way continuing on the situation, that they're quite content for everything to stay the way it is. So young Palestinians, and Palestinian society is a very young population with a very high birth rate, which we'll speak about a little bit more in a few moments' time, is incredibly disillusioned with their Palestinian leaders. Should also add that in the last year, we have seen Israel sign peace agreements with a number of Arab countries, particularly those in the Gulf, during the period of the Trump administration. This has been a real blow to the Palestinians and a great source of anger on the Palestinian street, because it feels like for them a betrayal by the Arab world, who have always spoken or paid lip service to the need to solve the Palestinian issue before peace can be made, a normalization of relations with Israel. And this is not what we've seen with Bahrain, with the United Arab Emirates, with Sudan, and so on and so forth over the last year. Should also mention, in 2004, Mahmoud Abbas was elected as president. In 2006, there were elections. This is the last time that there were elections, not for the president, but for within the Palestinian parliament. And in 2006, in the Palestinian elections, the Hamas won the elections. Now, when Hamas won the elections in 2006, on the one hand, we understand Hamas to be, and here is the original charter of the Hamas, talking about the obliteration of Israel and its unity of Islam, and trees telling Muslims that Jews are hiding behind them, very, very extreme things. But the Hamas was formed in 1988 as a Islamic social welfare organization. It has many social clubs, clinics, and social support for different and deprived communities within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So it has a very strong base of support. It wasn't initially a political movement. It was a welfare organization with a military and a terrorist wing, which is defined as terrorist by the European Union and the United States, and a military wing. And those wings are very separated. In 2006, Hamas stood for the first time in the Palestinian elections and entered politics and won the elections. The Hamas won around 44% of the seats. Fatah had around 41, 42% of the seats, also 120 of the Palestinian Legislative Council. Now, it's important to understand that we do not know whether people voted for Hamas in 2006 because of their virulent anti-Semitic Islamist ideology, or whether it was a way of protest at the corruption of the Fatah, the existing order of the Palestinians. In any case, important to say that ultimately, and we'll talk about it more shortly, the Hamas government was very, very short-lived. And in 2007, in a very bloody coup in Gaza, the Hamas murdered many members of Fatah. The Fatah were expelled from Gaza, and since 2007, Gaza has been under exclusively Hamas control, and the West Bank has been exclusively under the control of the Fatah and President Mahmoud Abbas, also known as Abu Mazen. Now, various prime ministers have come and gone in this period, but ultimately in control is the president, who's currently in the 17th year of his 4-year term. So we were speaking before about the disillusionment of the Palestinian youth, and we now begin to understand the issues there. Now, coming back over here to April. It's now April, and Palestinian elections are supposed to be taking place. Remember, Palestinian elections have not taken place since 2006. Now there are supposed to be Palestinian elections taking place. Understand that Abu Mazen, Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, is despised by many of the Palestinians. Hamas are still nonetheless viewed as more less corruptible and purer a form of ideology, so to speak, than the Fatah. And opinion polls, if you're interested, there's an incredible academic. His name is Khalil Shikaki. He's a Palestinian academic, and he has wonderful info. He's the best source of information about what's going on in Palestinian society in the university in Ramallah. And according to opinion polls, it was very likely that the Hamas were going to make significant gains in the West Bank. Now, that not only would not be good for Israel, but it wouldn't be good for the established political order in the West Bank either. And so Mahmoud Abbas, here he is, decided to cancel the elections. Now, the excuse for canceling the elections was that Israel was not going to allow all of the East Jerusalem Palestinians to vote. However, there is also a very strong argument that he cancelled the elections because he understood that he would lose considerable power to the Hamas if the elections took place. Now, with the cancellation of the Palestinian elections, this was a blow to the Hamas because they suddenly didn't have the ability to seize more political power in the West Bank. However, and it's a big however, we're now going to speak about the events in Jerusalem. And remember, it's very important to understand that the leadership of the Palestinians, Abu Mazen, the Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, already seen as corrupt and non-representative of many Palestinians, in league with Israel, we're now viewing, from the Palestinian perspective, Israeli aggressive actions in Jerusalem from a Palestinian perspective. This was now the chance for Hamas to place themselves and position themselves as the champions of the Palestinian people. And so we're about now to speak about Sheikh Jarrah and the Temple Mount Al-Aqsa, the noble sanctuary. But it's very interesting to look at the timing that on Monday the 10th, when the first rockets were fired, is immediately after all of the tension in Jerusalem had come to a head. And the Hamas themselves declared that they were firing rockets, ironically, on Jerusalem in order to defend Jerusalem. And so we understand, again, on the one hand, the idea that Hamas were firing rockets in order to defend Jerusalem. We also start to understand that, like Israeli politics, Palestinian politics has an awful lot going on, and the Hamas had a vested interest in starting an aggressive act in order to position themselves as the champions of Jerusalem and the Palestinian people. From here, let me pause a moment for a drink. If you have any questions and thoughts and so on, you're welcome to put them in, and we'll certainly open up at the end. I want to say a few words about Sheikh Jarrah. Now, I don't know if you may not have heard of Sheikh Jarrah. You may not understand what I'm talking about. Very few people did before the last few months, but I'll try and explain now why it's so important to understanding what's going on. You remember this map? This line here is the border between Israel and Jordan in Jerusalem between 1948 and 1967. After 1967, Israel comes into control of the eastern side and ultimately annexes the eastern side of Jerusalem to become part of Israel. One of the neighborhoods in East Jerusalem that had previously been part of Jordan and now fell under Israeli control in a unified, eternally undivided capital of Israel under Israeli political parlance is the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. I was asked about the Palestinian scholar. His name is Khalil Shikaki. Sounds a bit like shiitake mushroom, Shikaki. Very, very interesting to read, and publishes in English. We can see Jerusalem, again, whilst the largest city in Israel is not a large city, we can see deep into the west of Jerusalem over here. Sheikh Jarrah is actually located very, very, very close to the Green Line. It abuts the Green Line, which means it was very close to the divide between East and West between 1948 and 1967. Now, the story behind Sheikh Jarrah is very complicated. Before 1948 and the establishment of the State of Israel, or even before 1947 and the United Nations partition plan, all of Palestine that had not become an independent Jordan was under British control, British mandate Palestine, Palestine, the administrative name for the area. There were Jews living in many different places. And as I mentioned, in 1946, for example, there was already a strong, large Jewish majority in Jerusalem. And Jews in Jerusalem lived in both the east and the west of the city. I should note that Arabs in Jerusalem also lived in the east and the west of the city. After 1948, the eastern side of Jerusalem fell under Jordanian control. All of the Jews that lived on the eastern side of Jerusalem were forced to leave their homes in the east. I should also, of course, mention that the vast majority of Arabs living on the western side of Jerusalem also moved either to the eastern side of Jerusalem or to other areas as well. Small number of Arabs did remain in Jerusalem on the western side and received Israeli citizenship and a part of the same narrative, so to speak, or understanding as Israeli Arabs. But the vast majority of Arabs in Jerusalem leave the west and head to the east. But this story specifically, we're speaking about Jews who forfeit and lose their property in East Jerusalem. Now, after 1948, the Jordanians, having seized East Jerusalem, occupied and then annexing East Jerusalem, give the land and the homes that had previously been under Jewish control, and gave those homes to Palestinian Arabs. Some had come again from the west of the city, and some had come from outside Jerusalem. The vast majority of those homes were given over with title deed, but a small number of those homes, the deed was not transferred in ownership to the Arabs that began to live in those homes. And this is the story of Sheikh Jarrah. The vast majority of Arabs living in Sheikh Jarrah, again, it was a mixed neighborhood of a middle-class neighborhood of Muslims, Christians, and Jews before 1948. The vast majority of them were living there before and after 1948. There are also previously owned Jewish homes and land that Arabs are living in now, that the Arabs will maintain ownership over those homes because they have the deed transferred to them by the Jordanians. However, and this is the story of 6 families in Sheikh Jarrah that never received legal ownership over the properties. In 1967, when Israel took control of East Jerusalem, the areas, that Jewish property that had previously been legally owned by Jews before 1948 now came under Israeli control. Israel now controlling the east and the west of Jerusalem. And a legal process began going back to 1967, shortly after 1967, for the previous owners of that property to prove with the deeds legal ownership of the property and receive the property back. Some of those Jewish owners are represented by right-wing Jewish religious organizations. And again, this connects into the story of the more and more legitimacy of right-wing religious extreme. And that's not to say right-wing is bad or religious is bad, but extreme opinions on the street and organizations. And what has been happening for the last 2 decades, well, actually through to 1982, is a legal fight was fought all the way through to the beginning of the 1980s, when the decision was taken in the Supreme Court that those living in those homes were not the legal owners, but should not be forced to leave those homes, but rather should pay rent in order to remain dwelling in those homes. Now, it's important to understand the people living in those homes have been living in them since 1948. The oak tree in the garden, which is now taller than the house, was planted by the child of the family in 1948 as a young child. So there's great sentimental connection. And again, understanding that the narratives within Jerusalem and within the region are that Jerusalem is Al-Quds and Jerusalem should be the capital of Palestine, or that Jerusalem is Jewish and Jerusalem should be the capital of Israel. So we have these competing narratives over the same piece of land, and we also have very strong emotional connections. Since 1982, there has been continued legal battles over the unwillingness, and again, depending on your perspective, you can either understand the unwillingness to accept that the one should need to pay, and that they should be owners or not, but no rent was paid to the legal owners. And the situation we're in right now, which has come to a head over the last few weeks, is that we were waiting on 2 Mondays ago, a final decision on the Supreme Court that since no rent had been paid over this entire period, that it was now legally possible to evict those Palestinian Arabs living in those houses. Ultimately, that Monday, that decision was postponed. The government pushed upon the Supreme Court to postpone that decision because of the added tension that it would have added. And so that decision will be taken in around, unless it will be delayed again, in around 3 weeks' time. This is the story of Sheikh Jarrah, but it's also a lot more complicated than that. Why? It's more complicated than that because, first of all, in Jerusalem, we mentioned that Israel has taken control of the eastern side of Jerusalem. The vast majority of the 350,000 Palestinian Arabs in East Jerusalem are not citizens of the state of Israel, either because they don't want to be or because the mechanism for them to receive citizenship is difficult. The planning laws in the east of Jerusalem are far more draconian and difficult than in the western side of Jerusalem. There is a strong feeling amongst Palestinian Arabs in Jerusalem that they are being discriminated against within their own city, that many of them were born within. We hear a lot about illegal building in Jerusalem, but the population of the Arab population in Jerusalem is increasing, and land is not allocated by the municipality for the organic growth of the community. So often houses are built and then are knocked down as a result of being illegal. The argument on the Palestinian side is that the law itself is that it is legal, but the law itself is discriminatory. There are various things that we won't open up on now that cause many Palestinian Arabs and also many sympathizers also amongst the Jewish Israeli population to understand that Palestinian Arabs are discriminated against within Jerusalem. And the story of Sheikh Jarrah, on the one hand, can be presented as a simple real estate dispute with legal precedents that have been followed, as I explained. On the other hand, it has become a symbol of anger at what is perceived to be discrimination against Palestinian Arabs in Jerusalem. Should also be mentioned that there is no mechanism for Palestinian Arabs who own property in the west of Jerusalem before 1948 to regain their homes in the west of Jerusalem, property that they owned before 1948. So this is an incredibly complicated situation. It's a very difficult situation. It's a very unpleasant situation, frankly, to talk about. But with all of this going on, when you're hearing about protests and save Sheikh Jarrah, on the one hand, there are many people shouting and protesting that have no idea what the real story of Sheikh Jarrah is, that it is not necessarily a story of ethnic cleansing, genocide, and so on and so forth. However, it is a very difficult, complicated, and unpleasant story that has come, for those that do understand it, to represent a lot more than just Sheikh Jarrah itself. I was asked the question on the side, why is the blue, I think referring to this, on the eastern side of Jerusalem? I will say just a moment, this line was a temporary ceasefire line created at the end of November 1948 by Abdallah Attal and Moshe Dayan, the Israeli and Jordanian generals, with an old British mandate map they put on the floor in the middle of the fighting between Israelis and Jordanians in 1948. It was a temporary ceasefire line and it was never meant to be a permanent border. That's the reality of the green line that we hear is a holy line that a two-state solution should be based on. It was a temporary ceasefire line drawn up by generals, not politicians, neither of whom expected it to last more than a few weeks. Ultimately, it lasted 19 years. And this area over here is Mount Scopus, where the Hebrew University of Jerusalem was. And it's, despite being in the east, it was an Israeli enclave between 1948 and 1967 because Israeli forces held Mount Scopus in the east, although you had to go through the Jordanian controlled area in order to arrive to it. In any case, this is the story of Sheikh Jarrah. And I now, in the time we have left, want to move on and speak about Al-Aqsa Temple Mount. I hope it's useful and interesting and giving you a lot of perspective, I hope. In any case, I now want to speak about the last few weeks in Jerusalem. So first of all, just a short while ago, Ramadan finished. Ramadan is the 9th month of the Islamic calendar. It's an incredibly important and holy month. It's also a month when there are always heightened tensions in Jerusalem. Also an awful lot of West Bank Palestinians, Israeli Arabs and Jerusalem Palestinians meet together. So they meet, they discuss, they connect, and far more people are coming to Jerusalem, and it becomes a much greater hotbed of tension. This year, it was also a very hot Ramadan. People are fasting, so this also exacerbates. Now, in the context of the Ramadan, we also have the political issues going on, the vested interest on the Palestinian side to heat things up. We also understand that more right-wing feelings and actions falling out into the streets and the legitimization of extreme right-wing Jewish individuals and organizations in Israel and in Israeli politics. And of course, the story of Sheikh Jarrah, which has been coming to a head. And all of this added to the existing tensions that always exist in Ramadan in Jerusalem led to an explosion, not a physical explosion, but to an explosion of tension. Now, I should mention that right at the beginning of Ramadan, there was a series of Palestinian Arab youth who were attacking visibly identifiable Jews in Jerusalem, attacking them, recording it and posting it on social media or on TikTok. I don't have TikTok, maybe you do, but posting them on TikTok. It led to reprisal attacks by Jewish individuals on Palestinians in Jerusalem, and right-wing civil organizations, such as an organization called Lahava, also were involved in organizing against the violent Palestinians, and violent Palestinians were then acting against violent Jews. So we had an exacerbation of tension also connected to this right at the beginning of Ramadan. Because of all of these tensions that are going on, the police on a national level decided that during Ramadan, the steps, the area over here, which traditionally is the area that Muslims in Jerusalem and those that come to visit Jerusalem on Ramadan will gather at the end of each evening, each day, when the fast falls, and they will gather and meet here together to break the fast. The decision was taken by the police. And again, I understand that it was a decision taken on a national level that was then passed on to the head of the Jerusalem police, that this area would not be able to be a gathering space for Muslims in Jerusalem this Ramadan in order to reduce tensions. So goes the argument. The counter argument is that it was a deliberate decision to inflame tensions. And this again comes to this conspiracy theory connected with the leadership in Israel, Netanyahu, the wish to inflame a situation and cause the collapse of an anti-Netanyahu coalition. Either way, whatever position you fall on, this was yet another reason for Palestinians in Jerusalem, to Arabs in Jerusalem, to get incredibly angry. The second issue is connected to this place over here. As we mentioned before, it's the holiest place in the world for the Jewish people. It's where the temple stood, and the Western Wall is holy because of its proximity to the rock, the bedrock of Mount Moriah. For Muslims, it's one of the 3 holiest places in the world where Muhammad ascended to heaven, and a place of pilgrimage at Ramadan. Now, again, with all of these tensions going on, clashes between Israeli police and Palestinians here were almost inevitable. But I should also mention, just to give you a little bit more background, that in 1967, when Israel conquered the old city of Jerusalem, the East Jerusalem and West Bank from the Jordanians, it almost immediately gave back, so to speak. So Israel claimed control of this area and latterly sovereignty over this area. But the Waqf, which is an Islamic organization responsible for administering holy sites in Jerusalem under the Jordanian monarchy, was allowed to continue to administer the site. So Israel conquered the area from the Jordanians and then essentially handed civil control back to the Jordanians. Now, with this decision was the creation of what's often known as a status quo, meaning, and it's this idea that Israel is responsible for security here, but the Waqf, the Jordanian Waqf, are responsible for civil affairs, that Muslims are allowed to pray here in this area, and non-Muslims are not allowed to pray in this area. Muslims are allowed to enter at any time from any gate, and non-Muslims, Jews included, are only allowed to enter at prescribed times, not to interfere with Islamic prayer, and are not allowed to bring any non-Islamic prayer paraphernalia or prayer books up into this area at all. This is the situation, and any small changes or perceived small changes are considered to be very incendiary. Any small changes, for example, on the Israeli side, are seen as an attempt to change the status quo. One example, for example, is in 2017, when 2 Israeli border police were shot and killed here on top of the Temple Mount. Incidentally, they were both Arab citizens of Israel, killed by, ironically, also Arab citizens of Israel on behalf of the Palestinians. When that took place, Israel placed metal detectors on the entrances for Muslims onto the area. The Waqf organized a strike that and this idea that no Muslims would walk through the metal detectors and pray on top, as a protest that by putting the metal detectors, Israel was in some way trying to exert authority and change the status quo, as opposed to stop weapons being smuggled into an Islamic holy site. So just to give you some kind of understanding. Now, over the last couple of weeks or so, especially right before the outbreak of rocket fire from Gaza, we had clashes here on the area of the Temple Mount. Now, the narrative that you will receive depends on what news media you're reading. either you're looking at orchestrated clashes, and there are now ideas that even the direct involvement of Hamas involved in orchestrating the clashes, or at the very least, a spontaneous uprising against the Israeli police in this very tense time. The opposing point of view is that the Israeli police deliberately provoked the Palestinian prayer goers, broke the cables on a broadcast system on top of what Jews call Temple Mount, Muslims call Al-Aqsa, and made their way inside and into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Again, the flip side of that is that this idea that the Palestinians were deliberately hoarding and creating weaponry, and here we see inside Al-Aqsa Mosque, in order to fight the police. Again, chicken and egg, which came first, and ultimately, depending on the narrative that you find yourself exposed to, you're going to hear both of those different points of view. Just to make it even more tense, at this exact time when we're speaking more and more about this idea of competing national narratives on who Jerusalem should belong to, we also have this year that Ramadan falling together with Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day. Now, Jerusalem Day is a minor religious holiday and a national holiday in Israel, celebrating Israel's triumph in the War of 1967 and conquest of the old city and the eastern side of Jerusalem, the unification of the capital, the eternal capital of the Jewish people, Israel. Finally, after 19 years of the existence of the state of Israel, Jews can come and touch the stones of the Western Wall. Now, this was once a holiday that was a great consensus within Jewish Israeli society. On the other hand, in recent years, it's been a holiday that has increasingly been co-opted by those on the national religious, the settlers and the right wing. And one of the major events of Yom Yerushalayim is something called the March of the Flags, where the marchers celebrating walk through the Damascus Gate, which is the main gate into the Muslim quarter, and make their way all the way to the Western Wall. Now, this year, the decision was taken to cancel that route because it was felt that walking through the Muslim quarter would be cause too much tension with the Arabs in Jerusalem. The flip side argument by many is that how can we claim that Jerusalem is the capital of the state of Israel when there are places in Jerusalem that Jews and Jewish Israelis are not able to walk, not able to go, and not able to simply express their Israeli and Jewish identity. So these are the competing narratives. Should also mention that left-wing Jewish Israeli organization in 2015 had already put in a plea to the Supreme Court, which was rejected, that the march should no longer go through the Muslim quarter. The decision since then has been that the march should be allowed, but that any violence on either side, either Jewish or Arab, should be dealt with equally, of course, by the police in the scene. This year, the march was diverted in another way, with the hope that the violence wouldn't break out into open street violence and something worse. Ultimately, we now know 3 weeks later, or less than 2 weeks later, that ultimately it wasn't enough to avert the violence. Now, one of the pictures, the iconic images from this period of Yom Yerushalayim, which is 2 Sundays ago, is this image over here. And it really encapsulates everything we've been speaking about, because on the one hand, first of all, this picture has been shared on social media hundreds of thousands of times. One of the explanations of this picture is that Jews are maniacally, excitedly celebrating the destruction of the mosques behind the Western Wall in the area of Al-Aqsa. What we're actually seeing, and this is how it has been explained on many, again, this reductionist, simplistic social media of memes and slogans. The reality is obviously a lot more complicated, but no less troubling, I would suggest, is we see Jewish Israelis celebrating Yom Yerushalayim, and behind we see a tree on fire adjacent to the Dome of the Rock. And there is debate, again, whether it's a firework of a Palestinian on top of the area fighting the police that created the fire, or the Israeli police that set fire. These are the two opposing narratives of what is going on behind. On the flip side, I want to come back to when we were speaking about Hamas and say, if you remember, I said the sentence, which was rather tongue-in-cheek, that in defense of Jerusalem, Hamas is firing rockets on Jerusalem which is exactly what happened. And again, here we can see people celebrating Yom Yerushalayim at the exact time that there is a fire right next to the site of the Jewish temple. So we can see that something is not right in our societies on all sides. And that's also part of the story of what's going on here. Just in case we thought that all of this wasn't complicated enough with Sheikh Jarrah and what's going on in Jerusalem and Ramadan and Yom Yerushalayim, that during the week after the rockets had already been fired, it was a day that Palestinians around the world commemorate called Nakba Day. Nakba Day, which was on May the 15th. Well, remember we mentioned Israelis call independence, Palestinians call Nakba, the catastrophe. And this is a day when Palestinians commemorate their loss in 1948 and ultimately what they define as the occupation of Palestine. And it's very important to understand what they define as the occupation of Palestine begins in 1948. Actually, I wanted to show you, this is a tweet from a Christian Arab ambassador for Israel in Azerbaijan. His name is George Deek. And he mentions that his own family was affected by the Nakba, but he wrote something very interesting. He says the Nakba Day was not set on April the 9th, when on the date that Palestinians say was they call the Deir Yassin massacre. Again, there is the Israeli perspective, the mainstream Israeli perspective that it wasn't a massacre, but there is an idea that Arabs were killed, intimidated, and so on in just outside Jerusalem in the village of Deir Yassin, or the expulsion of the Arabs from Lod after the creation of the state on July 13th. But he mentions that the fact that the Nakba Day was set on May 15th expressly connects the Nakba to the establishment of the state of Israel. This idea being that the commemoration is not of the loss of the Palestinians, but rather of the creation of the state of Israel. And that's very important because when we're talking about occupation, when I say occupation and you say occupation and someone else says occupation, we all have different meanings. Some say there's no occupation at all. Some say Israel is an occupying power since 1967. As we heard with the PLO being set up in 1964, and right here, many define occupation not as returning to 67 boundaries in a Palestinian state, but the very existence of Israel since 1948. That is also part of the story. And when we're simplistically going back to the social media and the news, when we hear people use certain words, we need to understand what those words mean, because occupation doesn't necessarily include or mean for everyone post 1967. For many, it means the very existence of the state of Israel. Now I'm going to move across to Gaza. I know it's been a little long, but it's a lot to talk about, so I hope it's interesting. Thank you for staying with me. I mentioned before, this is now Gaza, and you can see exactly where Gaza is. This is the Gaza Strip over here. Again, it's around up to around 8 miles wide, 25 miles long. Arab, predominantly Muslim, almost exclusively Muslim. There's around 1,000 Christian Arabs, I think, inside Gaza. A population of over 2 million people inside this tiny area. Now, after 2005, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip all of its forces, but it withdrew unilaterally. It was not done in coordination with the Palestinian Authority. And again, it's important to stress this. When Israel withdrew from all of its military forces and the settlements, and also 4 settlements from the northern West Bank as well, on the one hand, the Palestinians were now inside the Strip without any Israelis inside. On the other hand, Israel was still in control of the land border over here. There is no airport inside Gaza, and Israel was also monitoring the shipping as well over here. However, there was no blockade on Gaza. The blockade on Gaza, or the much stronger checks on everything coming in and out, or particularly into Gaza, was after 2007, when the Hamas violently overthrew and kicked out the Fatah, out the other Palestinian faction, out of the Gaza Strip. And from that point on, there have been many rockets falling or being thrown from Gaza over and into Israel. Again, here's just an image of the settlements that were pulled out. Now, I want to bring you to what's going on at the present day. On May the 10th, and now we've put into context Jerusalem, Palestinian politics. On May the 10th, Hamas, which is a radical Islamic terrorist organization on the one hand, and an Islamic charity and welfare organization on the other, which is the sole dictator and controller of the Gaza Strip, which has been digging tunnels into Israel, which has been sending incendiary balloons into Israel, which has been kidnapping Israelis from Israeli territory and firing rockets at various points since 2007, started to fire rockets into Israel. Just to show you, again, this is a snapshot. This is an app that pretty much every Israeli has on their phones, which tells you when sirens are going off and where rockets are falling and so on. And this is just, for example, one evening, looking at the number of rockets that fell at any particular snapshot of the rockets that fell over a number of hours inside Israel. Just to put into perspective, 5.5 million of Israel's 9.3 million population were within range of the Hamas, rockets, and also the rockets of another extreme organization, the Islamic Jihad, as well, from inside Gaza. So on the one hand, over the next 11 days from May the 10th, something like 4,500 rockets are fired into Israel. Many of them are falling in various places. Somewhere in the order of, I think, around 13% are aimed specifically or are due to fall specifically on built-up urban areas. This, for example, is a result of a rocket fall in the city of Holon, which took the life of one person in this case. So on the one hand, Hamas is firing copious amounts of rockets down on Israel, as well as mortars, which are not able to be shot down by the Iron Dome, which I'll speak about in a moment. In response, Israel is attacking targets inside Gaza. Gaza, as we saw before, is an incredibly small place with an incredibly large population. One of the issues, and again, we're seeing here one of around 1,500 pinpoint attacks inside Gaza. The Israeli military explains that it is attacking specific military targets. However, because of the fact that Hamas are based within urban areas, and again, are deliberately fighting from within urban areas in order to maximize Palestinian casualties, and of course, there are always going to be innocent people, women and children and men as well, innocent people that are dying as a result of Israeli airstrikes. At no point during the 11 days does Israel send ground forces into Gaza, but it is making pinpoint attacks from the air. Now, one of the things that has been spoken about a great deal is the issue of proportionality. That has been a huge theme that has been spoken about a great amount. The picture we see here are a picture of rockets from Gaza being fired into Israel. What we see over here, it's an incredible picture. The picture that we see over here are missiles from of a system called the Iron Dome. The Iron Dome is not a dome, and it's not made of iron, but it's a special rocket system that fires Israeli rockets. It judges the trajectory of Palestinian rockets, whether they be Islamic Jihad or Hamas rockets coming out of Gaza, understands whether they're going to fall in open areas, in which case they can be left. And if they're going to fall in areas that could be a threat to life or property, the rockets are able to track them in the sky, as you can see, and shoot the rockets out of the sky. In this particular period of conflict, something like 90% of the Hamas rockets were shot out of the sky. So just under, or somewhere around 4,500 rockets, 90% of those rockets were shot down by the Iron Dome, which is an incredible statistic. However, it does mean that 10% of the rockets were falling inside Israel, and 12 people inside Israel lost their lives as a result of the attacks. Should also be mentioned that close to 700 of the rockets fired by Hamas also fell inside Gaza. And this is where I want to connect very, very briefly to the issue of proportionality, because one very common theme is the idea of Israeli genocide of the Palestinians, specifically with regard to Gaza. Should mention that the annual growth rate of the Palestinian population in the West Bank is approaching 2%, and the annual growth of the Palestinian population in Gaza is almost 3%, which is an incredibly high level. For a high level. Should also mention in Operation Protective Edge, which was the last operation, 1,400 people in Gaza lost their lives, which is an amalgam of innocent civilians and Hamas fighters. Again, it's very difficult to have a very strong understanding of who is who. Also because all of the information that the international media receive about victims in Gaza comes from the Hamas Health Ministry. Should also mention something very, very interesting, that this is a chart which shows the use of precision missiles in conflict. So you can see here, for example, of Allied forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, for example, 55%, 68%. We can see here Gaza in 2008, Israel 81%. In this particular conflict, Israel used 100% of the missiles that Israel fired were able to specifically target within a meter or so a specific location. But part of the issues of proportionality, of course, are related to the fact that on the one hand, Israel is, and this is one of the anger, I can tell you in Israel, many people that would define themselves as critical on the left in Israel find themselves reacting out against criticism of Israel externally because of this idea of proportionality, that in some way things are not proportional because Israel is designing systems in order to protect itself, whilst Hamas is deliberately seeking to maximize casualties in order to gain PR or to gain a certain effect in the international media. So it's an incredibly complicated situation. Should also mention, and just while we're finishing up the part of Gaza, is talking about what is victory, because you may now see that we've arrived at a ceasefire, and you can see Israel claiming victory, for example. Why is Israel claiming victory? Because it managed to take out a significant number of Hamas fighters. I should mention that we understand in terms of the number of deaths on the Palestinian side is somewhere around 230, and something like 100 to 120 of those, as far as I understand, are those that were not combatants involved in that. Just to put in perspective, that's an approximately 2-to-1 ratio of combatant, or 1-to-1 rather, combatant to not combatant, which is a far better ratio, as horrific it is to say better about innocent deaths, than any conflict that any European or any other European power, Britain or America, have been involved with at any point. Should also mention that in terms of the genocide, one of the decisions taken by Israel was not to send ground forces in. One of the reasons not to send ground forces in is, first of all, because it will inevitably result in a much greater level of loss of life of Palestinians, but also of a much greater level of loss of life of Israeli soldiers as well. Now, jumping forward as we're coming towards the end, and saying a few words about victory. Both politicians in Israel and the Hamas have claimed victory. Israel, one could argue, could claim victory because a large network of underground tunnels have been destroyed that were used by the Hamas. Significant amount of the weaponry and the planning equipment of the Hamas has been destroyed, and the ability. And again, one of the arguments is that this will have a deterrent effect and will limit the amount of attacks that will come from Gaza in the next few years. The flip side of that argument, and this is the claim of victory from the Hamas. How could it be argued that Hamas comes out with a victory? First of all, one could argue that Hamas has come out with a victory in terms of international PR. There is also an idea that Hamas deliberately, as we spoke about, wanted to foment unrest between Jews and Arabs in Israeli society. Hamas wants to see an Islamic emirate and the destruction of Israel and the establishment of a Palestinian state. It certainly doesn't want to see coexistence and Arabs and Jews working together inside a government coalition inside Israel. Could also argue that, and it stands to reason, or we don't yet know, whether there really is a deterrent effect. Hamas is funded by Iran. despite the fact that it's Sunni, it's a Sunni Islamic organization, and the Iranians are Shiite. Right now, today, there have been demonstrations and members of Hezbollah amassing themselves on Israel's northern border in 2 different locations. Hezbollah is a Shiite terrorist organization operating from Lebanon, the most powerful military force, and it is also backed financially in terms of money and also in terms of training and equipment by the Iranians as well. So there is, if we zoom out, there is an awful lot more going on. It's very easy to zoom in and look at Israel versus Hamas or Israel versus Palestine. However, there is also an awful lot more going on as well. So whether it is a victory or not a victory, is a very, very difficult thing to understand. I'm going to leave it there, and I want to move across. One more thing very briefly is also to mention Biden. One of the things that we've heard in the last few weeks is by Israeli commentators is that perhaps had Donald Trump still been in power, it's possible that Hamas would not necessarily have acted the way that they have. Again, I have to be honest and say that I'm not inside the minds of Hamas, but this idea that perhaps this was an opportunity to test and to see how Biden would react and how the Democratic Party in the United States would act. What I will say is that in the last day or so, and I have a quote that I wanted to read, that President Biden has put out a statement saying there is no shift in my commitment to the security of Israel, no shift, period. What we still need is a 2-state solution. It is the only answer. And very interestingly, until the region says unequivocally that they acknowledge the right of Israel to exist as an independent Jewish state, there will be no peace, which is a very, very interesting thing to say. The last thing I wanted to say on victory as well is lastly, from a Hamas point of view, it's undeniably a victory in placing themselves, as we mentioned before, as champions of the Palestinian street, defenders of Jerusalem, fomenting unrest inside Israel. And whilst we spoke before about the Abraham Accords and peace between Israel, or normalization between Israel and certain Arab countries, putting the Palestinian issue seemingly on the back burner, all of the events of the last couple of weeks have certainly pushed the Palestinian issue back into the mainstream. And many Arab countries, whilst being prepared to criticize both sides, which is in itself a major departure, certainly are talking once more about the need to make or arrive at a solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians, whether that be with Hamas or not. Right now, the discussions are about how will the rebuilding take shape. Again, going back to President Biden speaking about supporting Israel in its ability to defend itself, which again is interesting because of elements within the Democratic Party that would like to see aid cut. The same things are being spoken about in the Labour Party in the UK. But at the same time, there are also discussions about how the rebuilding in Gaza will take place. And again, the major victories is not only Hamas placing itself as the champions, but also emasculating the Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, and showing them as impotent versus the Hamas. One of the things that the Americans have done is said that the aid that will be passed to Gaza will be passed through the Palestinian Authority. So there are certainly wishes to strengthen the Palestinian Authority. Israel itself is also talking about finding a way to bring materials into Gaza without them falling into the hands of the Hamas in order to use them for rebuilding. What will happen? We don't know, but these are the issues that are going on. The last thing that I want to talk about, and you're welcome to disappear, I know it's been long, but for me, this is perhaps one of the most important issues of all, is the issues of Arab-Jewish relations inside Israel. Now, I've spoken a little about the fact that Arab Israelis received citizenship after 1948, although at the same time, many Arabs inside Israel were under military rule through to 1966. Now, on the one hand, it's understandable since the green line, as we've seen clearly today, is an arbitrary line that divided between Arabs and Arabs, Palestinian Arabs and Palestinian Arabs, that some ended up in Israel, received citizenship, and others didn't, and that there are those that connect to the Palestinian narrative, and many who today are loyal and important members of Israeli society as well. Nonetheless, as I mentioned, Israel Arab society is incredibly diverse. There are many different opinions. In fact, I can mention the term Arab Israeli, but there are, according to sociologists, as what I've read, 29 different ways that Arabs in Israel define themselves, being from an Israeli Bedouin or a Bedouin citizen of Israel to a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship, to a Palestinian, to an Arab Israeli, to an Israeli Arab, to an Israeli. Everyone, depending on their perspective, their standpoint, and their experience, defines themselves in a different way. In any case, as we spoke about, traditionally, many Arabs inside Israeli society, whether it be for national reasons or whether it be on a very personal level, feeling that there is discrimination in society, many Arabs in Israeli society traditionally do feel that they are playing second fiddle to others within Israeli society. As I mentioned before, there are other groupings within Israeli society, also Jewish society, that also feel the same, but it doesn't necessarily have the same national connotations as well. I want to come back again to what was going on 3 weeks ago, which is, again, we were about potentially to see a huge, huge change. Now, whether it would happen or wouldn't happen, we don't know, it's counterfactual. But right before everything fell down, it seemed that perhaps we were going to see an example of greater integration than we've ever seen before, and the entry of an Arab political party into Israeli politics. As we mentioned before, ultimately, it didn't happen. All of the situation fell apart, both in terms of Hamas and Israel in Gaza, but also we saw, connected to all of the stories going on, many Arabs in Israel letting vent violence and extremism out into the streets of Israel. Now, over here I have a picture of the city of Lod. I showed you on the map a little bit earlier on. Lod is actually the Ben Gurion airport, used to be called Lod Airport. So this is not some outlying area. This is a mixed city of Jews and Arabs in the very center of Israel. And particularly in mixed cities like Akko, Haifa, Nazareth with the upper section, Lod, particularly in mixed cities, a huge amount of violence, frustration, and violence took place. Attacks on Jewish residents of the cities, lynchings, attacks, burning of synagogues, buildings, throwing incendiaries through windows. Very, 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 very violent action that really incredibly shocked Israeli society, and particularly the people that lived in these cities. I mentioned before, I've given Haifa as an example of coexistence. And so you can imagine in a city where people are very proud, both Jewish and Arab, of their ability to get along, suddenly these violent actions came as quite a shock. Once we had violent actions of Arabs within Israeli society against Jews, we also had Jews angrily attacking Arabs as well. In Bat Yam, just south of Tel Aviv, we had a lynching of an Arab by a group of young Jews. In Jaffa, interestingly, we had an Arab child who had his face burned by an incendiary device that was thrown into the home. Interestingly, many Arabs got very angry about the fact that the child was burnt, seemingly by Jewish extremists, and many of the left wing in Israel were very eager to talk about how there was symmetry between Jewish and Arab violence in the society, and blowback from many in Israeli society that said, this is not symmetry. These are isolated Jewish incidents against mass violence by Arab society. Interestingly, ultimately, the police arrested an Arab who had mistakenly thrown an incendiary device into an Arab home. Very, very, on the one hand, interesting, but incredibly violent and incredibly sad. All of this going on, again, this seeming breakdown of society has come as a huge shock. And it's also created a huge disconnect in Israeli society. I can tell you, and now I'm going to speak personally, lynching has a particular definition, as I'm just reading on the side, lynching has a particular definition leading to death in the US. Yes, we're talking about people that are being hit, stabbed, stones thrown at them with the intention of murder. I can tell you that in not far from where I live, just answering a question on the side, I live in close to Wadi Ara, where I live. There was a family driving in a car. I told some of you that I was going to do a tour in Megiddo, and I decided not to. They were driving along the road that I would have taken to Megiddo, and they were attacked in their car and were saved by the grace of, if you believe in God, they were saved by the grace of God. So these are real things that were going on. Again, for many Israelis, they started to talk about whether this is some kind of historical moment and harking back to the late 1920s and 1930s of attacks of pogroms or attacks by Arabs on Jews back in the pre-state period. On the other hand, there are many people inside Israeli society that believe very deeply in coexistence on both the Arab side and the Jewish side. Now, if we take a step back, we can see that the number of people involved in violence on both the Jewish side and the Arab side is infinitesimally small compared to the large number of law-abiding people. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that there are not those within Arab Israeli society that have very strong grievances against Israel regarding Jerusalem, feelings of affinity or connection Palestinians, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they support violent actions and that this is the way that protests should be put out there. At the same time, there are very many Jews and Arabs that believe very, very deeply in the idea of a shared society and really living together. And I just wanted to show, just as an example, barely a month ago, we had a mass casualty incident involving ultra-Orthodox people celebrating Lag BaOmer in Meron. And amongst the first people that volunteered came to the scene in order to deal with the crisis and opened up their villages in the area in order to look after people that have been injured were Israeli Arabs. At the same time, and now I'm going to speak very personally and say the conversations that I'm hearing, for example, in my city, is that for many Jewish Israelis, it's very difficult right now to divorce between the Arabs that are involved in perpetrating violence and the Arabs that are not perpetrating violence. And many people saying they did this, they were helping us here and now they're trying to murder us. And trying to explain to people, again, the nuanced difficulty and the nuanced complexity of who is doing what, and whether there are also Arabs that are rejecting the violence and so on and so forth. And I can tell you right now in my town, people are talking very openly about boycott, not going into Israeli towns and cities, not just because necessarily of fear of attack, but because they want to in some way boycott or not put money in the hands of Arabs. At the same time, one can understand the fear and the hysteria, but again, when we break it down person to person, things are an awful lot more complicated than that. I wanted to finish on, I guess, a little bit of a positive note, if it's even possible to do so. I wanted to, in terms of what will happen between Jews and Arabs, many people have been working on coexistence and living together, true living together, which means listening to each other and accepting different narratives for a very long time. I believe, and now I will give my opinion, that it's going to be very long and difficult in order to bring us back to a place where the majority of Jews and Arabs trust each other. There's also a great disconnect because, and I'll speak about it now, a few days ago, the Arab civil society called a strike in Israel. And the strike in Israel was a strike that was called in order to draw attention to discrimination against Arabs in Israel and in support of Palestinians. Many people in Israel became incredibly angry. This idea that in some way supporting Palestinians means supporting or caring for Palestinians means supporting Hamas, that these two things are exactly the same. Cellcom, which was one of the largest phone and internet companies, took 1 hour, and over here it says Arabs and Jews choose to live together. Arabs and Jews refuse to be enemies. And in Cellcom, again, most large companies in Israel, as it's a country genuinely where everyone is together in both the higher levels of management to people on the shop floor. And in Cellcom, there are many Jews and Arabs, and they decided to take 1 hour, that they would take an hour off from work. This campaign has led to tens of thousands of people in Israel disconnecting from Cellcom in protest. At the same time, and I think incredibly brave, one of the largest, I think even maybe the largest insurance company in Israel, even after the reaction that dropped the share price of Cellcom and the loss of tens of thousands of members, put out a campaign. This was in the national press. It says here in both Arabic and Hebrew, this is an insurance company, the best insurance against violence is coexistence. And I think, again, what we need, if we are going to see, hopefully, not only a restoration, but a betterment of our situation internally, because I have to say, we don't necessarily have high expectations of Hamas. Hamas are a terrorist organization, still not prepared to countenance the existence of Israel. So on the one hand, what's happened with Hamas is terrible, but it's not altogether surprising. What's happened in Israeli society internally is incredibly shocking and will have a huge impact on our society if we give up. So what will happen next needs an awful lot of work, and it needs the silent majority, so to speak, to start to step forward and try and affect change. I wanted to finish, as I mentioned, with a small point of, I guess, hope. Someone asked me before about lynching. This was one of the Jewish victims in Lod. His name is Yigal Yoshua. By all accounts, I understand he'd actually been at synagogues or celebrating the consecration of a new Sefer Torah scroll when he was beaten, had stones thrown at him, and his head received severe damage to his head from a brick, and ultimately passed away on the 17th of May. And he was beaten up by his neighbors in Lod, which is incredibly shocking. So again, when we're talking about fear and hysteria, it's understandable on all sides. At the same time, we understand that his family decided that that he never signed a donor card, but that he always said that his family should make the decision over what he should do. And so following his passing away, his family decided to donate his organs. And amongst the organs that were donated was his kidney. And his kidney was given to this woman over here. She's 58 years old. Her name is Randa Awais. She's an Arab Israeli. She's been waiting 9 years for a kidney. And she received the kidney of the Jewish gentleman that was murdered in Lod by the Arabs. And I just wanted to read for you what she said. She said, Yigal, speaking about the person about Yigal, who sadly was murdered, and it's his kidney that has saved her life. Yigal will go straight to heaven, to a better place. Here we must all, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, strive for peace. All of us. I can't wait to host Yigal's family in my home. And I was talking before about Haifa, and I just wanted to show you again. This is a colleague and friend of mine. His name is Hani, that we work with, and it says here in Hebrew, sort of like love your friend as yourself, and an example of many Jews and Arabs, Christians, Muslims reaching together and saying, not in my name, that Israel is a society that looks after all of its people, and we need to work hard to make sure that it will be a society for all of its citizens. And I wanted to finish just before we open up for questions. I just wanted to show you a very short clip which was created by the council heads of a particular part of Israel, because I think this is an example of what we should see more in order to be able to repair the situation.
תגידו לי, מה קורה פה? יצאנו מדעתנו? אני לא אוהב שלך, עדל.
אנחנו לא אויבים. אני רואה את מעשי האלימות והסתה, ואני קורא לכולם להפסיק זאת מיידית.
אנחנו נבחרות ונבחרי הציבור של יותר מ500,000 ישראלים שחיים ביחד באשכול השרון, יהודים וערבים.
ואנחנו לא ניגרר אחרי השנאה וההרס שמובילים הקיצוניים.
לא ניתן לקיצוניים שבתוכנו להרוס את מה שבנינו יחד במשך שנים.
יש לנו יחסי מסחר מצוינים עם השכנים שלנו, ואנחנו רוצים להמשיך לקיים אותם.
לא נשכח את הקשרים המרגשים שנוצרו בשנה האחרונה בין צוותים רפואיים, ערבים ויהודים, בהתמודדות משותפת עם מגפת הקורונה.
נמשיך לשתף פעולה כדי להפוך את החיים של כולנו לטובים יותר.
לא ניתן לקיצוניים להרוס את כל מה שבנינו.
אז הנה התשובה שלנו, של כולנו.
את מה שמנסים להרוס, אנחנו נדאג לתקן.
את הקשרים שהם רוצים לפרום, אנחנו נדאג לחזק.
אף אחד מאיתנו לא הולך לשום מקום. קיצוניים אלימים השתלטו על חיינו, ואנחנו חייבים להחזיר את החיים לשגרה.
מכאן אנחנו מחזקים את המשטרה במאמציה להשיב את החיים למסלולם. אנחנו מצידנו נמשיך לפעול כדי שנוכל לחיות פה ביחד, באשכול השרון ובכל הארץ.
There are a lot of people around the world telling us that we hate each other, telling us that we don't belong together, telling us that only one is right and the other is completely wrong, or that the other one is completely wrong and the other is right. But there are an awful lot of people here in this region, both Arabs and Israelis inside Israel and Israelis and Palestinians, that do understand that it is possible to disagree without completely delegitimizing the other point of view, that we're in an incredibly complex and sophisticated place where multiple narratives exist, and sometimes those narratives overlap. It is possible for two people to have diametrically opposed opinions and for it not to be that one of them is lying and not telling the truth.